Each year, more than 46 million Americans will seek emergency room treatment for an accidental injury, most of which are preventable. So, what are your risks, and who can you trust to protect you? This is Safety Matters with Russ Kenzior.
This is Russ Kenzior, and you're listening to Safety Matters.
Safety Matters in the news.
Each week I always start out talking about coronavirus, since that's kind of the lead safety matter in the news. But today I'm going to talk about one of the industries that has been most widely impacted by the coronavirus, and that's the restaurant industry. QSR Magazine, Quick Service Restaurant Magazine.com, put out a story entitled Effective Risk Mitigation Strategies for Restaurants. And not only did it talk about the COVID-19 crisis, both financially, but also from a safety perspective. The top three hazards for restaurants are fire, slips and falls, and food safety. Fire hazards represent about 30% of non-residential building fires, and most start in kitchens. Restaurants are more prone to this type of problem since they do cooking, a lot of cooking, and have overhead ventilation systems that can accumulate grease and oil over time, causing a potential ignition and fire. And so they recommend cleaning hoods and ventilation systems. In the restaurant industry, that can be done professionally, but also in your home. That's an important message because although it might take longer for your ventilation systems in your kitchens to accumulate the same amount of grease and oil as that of a restaurant, nonetheless, over time, that can cause a fire in the home. They also recommend keeping fryers cleaned and free of any type of ignition source. Changing the oil is important because as oil becomes old or used, the likelihood that it could ignite also elevates. And so keep the kitchen grease to an all-time minimum, which segues appropriately into the second category, which are slips and falls. Most employee-related or guest-related claims, for that matter, are related to walkway safety. Oftentimes, grease or oil or water that's on the floor will create a slip hazard. So this, of course, is a subject very dear to my heart. To avoid slips and falls, obviously, you want to keep your floors clean. I recommend, using NFSI-certified floor cleaning products. They have the best performance, proven performance, in keeping floors slip-resistant or high traction, even when wet. The story goes on to recommend posting of wet floor signs at entrances and continuously monitoring housekeeping, the restaurant. And then lastly, make sure your people are wearing slip-resistant, or what will soon be known as high-traction footwear, to prevent slips and falls by your employees. The third area is food safety, and we all have familiarity with this area of restaurant safety since oftentimes people get sick after dining out. And so, number one, keep the refrigeration, and this also is important for home use. Keep your refrigerators at 41 degrees or less. Make sure that any of the food that's getting older in the refrigerator is either disposed of or rotated frequently, because even as the food gets older, it gives off spores of fungus and bacteria and could contaminate other food that's in the refrigerator. And then lastly, make sure that you're cooking the food to the appropriate temperature so people don't get sick. If you don't do that, it can really create problems for your restaurant and in an industry that's now being really just crushed. Every dime makes a difference. So keep your restaurant safe and also keep your home safe. Second story I want to speak to is one that was put out by lawyers.com, and it was entitled Common Types of Business Lawsuits. And of course, that includes slips and falls of employees and guests, but also, according to the Small Business Administration, up to a half of all businesses, small businesses, are likely to be sued in any given year, and practically all businesses are subject of a lawsuit at some point during their existence. And that's sadly very true. And if you talk to anyone that's been in business long enough, they'll tell you they've had some legal issue that they had to deal with, a lawsuit. Lawsuits can be very costly on several levels, especially to a small business owner. Litigation, according to the story, can cause both emotional and financial hardship. It may also force a business business to change the way it operates. Business owners can save time and money and avoid potential lawsuits, according to the story, by simply consulting an attorney that has qualifications and a background, understanding the type of litigation that may take place for your business. The two most common types of lawsuits are either employee lawsuits or customer lawsuits. Most lawsuits filed by employees are not only expensive, but command a lot of attention from the press. In fact, the story went on to say that in a 15-year period, Merrill Lynch paid nearly $500 million to settle sexual harassment and racial discrimination claims, which, employee-related lawsuits can be of a wide range. Harassment, whistleblower claims, wrongful termination, breach of contract, on and on and on, while customer-related or guest-related lawsuits just tend to fall into three categories, and that's premises liability, discrimination, and customer satisfaction, or I should say lack of satisfaction. The story stated that premises liability lawsuits not only include slips and falls, but the surrounding conditions that may lead to a slip and fall, where wet floor signs are not posted, the floors were improperly maintained, or in a hazardous condition for a long period of time, and the property owner simply didn't take remedial action to remove those hazards. Premises liability lawsuits may also involve situations in which the business failed to provide adequate lighting, security cameras, or locks, which resulted in an injury. Don't forget that your parking lot is part of your business, and if somebody is hurt in your parking lot or robbed for any form of crime that takes place in your parking lot, that also may lead to litigation. According to the Small Business Association, legal costs for small businesses typically range between $10,000 and can go as high as $150,000. I mean, lawsuits are very, very expensive, and so you want to keep them down, keep them at an all-time low, if possible. And of course, larger companies pay even higher fees. But again, the real cost tends to come down to emotional hardships and just the upheaval in one's life from having to go through litigation. And so if you're a restaurant owner, you got enough problems. And if you're a business owner, you may also want to take notice of the fact that lawsuits are on the rise. And so do what you have to do to make sure your business is safe and you keep your costs down. When Safety Matters returns, I'll be playing the second interview with U.S. congressional candidate Beth Van Duyne, who's running for the Texas 24th District for the U.S. House of Representatives. I aired the first part of my interview with her last week, and we'll be playing the second part when Safety Matters returns.
Safety Matters with Russ Kenzier will be right back.
Welcome back to Safety Matters. I've been interviewing Beth Van Duyne, who is a candidate for Texas 24, running for the open seat. One question that comes up a lot is really related to control, state control, local control, national control. It seems like a lot of elected officials have an opinion one way or the other. As a Texan, Texans generally like to talk about local control, school boards, right, city. What's your view of district control? Well,
I am running against an opponent who has talked about federal government control and basically wanting every part of our life to be controlled by the federal government and all local officials to just look to the federal government to tell them what to do. And when I was mayor, when I was on city council, that's like the last thing that you want. We never went to the federal government and said, hey, can you solve this issue in this neighborhood for us? We live here. Our kids go to school here. My job is to go out in the community and talk to people in their neighborhoods, in their places of worship, in their businesses, and find out what their needs are and what they want. Nobody from D.C. is doing that. And the same kind of solutions that you're going to give to somebody in California or New York is not necessarily, and I'll tell you probably most of the time, not going to be appropriate for what we need here. So I think local leaders need to step up. They need to realize that nobody forces them to run these positions, and if they are going to run for them and they actually get elected, their job is to solve those problems, to work with members of their community, to work with members of their department, to work with the state and the federal government where necessary, but the buck stops there. And I never looked to the federal government because you're in the communities. And I think when we start handing over control of our health care, when we start handing control over our education to the federal government, we are completely missing the bus. This is Texas. That is not what we want.
Now, you have some experience. You worked with Secretary Ben Carson.
I did. Wonderful man.
Housing and Urban Development. Tell us a little bit about that experience.
Well, we have tried thinking outside the box. One of the things I loved about him when I first interviewed with him early on was he said we need to change our focus. We need to stop looking at our success as by the number of people we get in our programs and start judging our success by the people that we graduate out of our programs. Talking about empowering people, giving them tools to be able to succeed on their own, giving them opportunities to be able to create generational wealth. We did this rental reform, for example, and one of the things that he wanted to do was if people live in public housing, every month put an amount of money into escrow. That if they take care of their properties, if they learn how to take care of their homes, if they're not destroying the places that they live, when they leave public housing, they actually have money to be able to put down payment on a home. And we found that people who actually had homes had almost 500 times the value, the wealth that people who rented had. And you start thinking about that. That is wealth that accumulates that you can then put down to the next generation. You're passing that down. So you're breaking those cycles of poverty. Those are some of the things that we need. And, in the city of Irving, we were talking about crime earlier in our police. It's thinking outside the box. One of the things that we had done was looked at a neighborhood that we had put a lot of police officers and spent a lot of time and resources on. This neighborhood was full of crime. We had gangs, we had criminal activity, we had prostitution, sex trafficking, drugs sales, and it was right across the street from a middle school. And, you could put as many police officers there, but the crime still existed. What we ended up doing is working with our state and federal leaders to figure out how we could solve what the problem was, which is we had a bunch of empty homes that actually contributed to the crime. We bought those homes, we raised those homes, and we ended up building affordable housing. And we took this neighborhood from being one completely crime-ridden across the street from a middle school to now it's a thriving neighborhood representing hope and opportunity. It was not a police solution. It was a policy solution, but we saw 80% crime rate almost overnight there.
Economics plays a big role in poverty and safety.
Sure
if you look at some of the most underprivileged communities, higher rates of drug abuse, crime in general, and all that's really an economic factor. And it can be solved through leadership. I think it was Ronald Reagan who said we prefer to give people a hand up, not a hand out, and empower them.
Yeah.
And that's an important perspective that not everybody has. There are some people that really, elected officials that frankly don't mind keeping people impoverished.
And I don't think we want that. I think, most Americans, people come here from around the world. They fight to get here because they realize if you work hard, you can succeed. Right. And our policy should be representative of that. You don't want to put anybody in a position that they can't get out of.
Right.
So offering tools of training, having good schools, having kids be able to make a choice of what school they go to, parents being able to make a choice of what school, which is in the best interest of their kids, getting kids back in school. Right? Yeah. That is a terrible problem that we have right now, but it is giving individuals the freedom and the opportunities.
The American dream.
Yes, absolutely. And it should be alive and well. And I'm seeing folks on the other side of the aisle that are embarrassed about the American dream and apologizing for the American dream and actually seemingly fighting it. And I think you're seeing Republicans and others that are not on, on the radical left that are saying, no, this is a country worth fighting for.
Amen.
We have had ideals here, best country in the world, and we need to fight for it.
Let's shift gears a little bit. Public safety comes in all shapes and sizes. Our infrastructure needs. We have crumbling roads and highways and bridges. We were told years ago under the Obama administration that there were these shovel-ready jobs. I think we invested $1 trillion. And most people say, where did it go? I mean, how do you propose solving some of our deteriorating infrastructure requirements?
That's a great question. I'll tell you, I think it's one of the biggest failures that we've seen in the last 2 years of Congress is not passing an infrastructure bill. We saw a whole class of new Democrat Congress members that got elected, during their campaign say we were going to be new and we're going to focus on what's important to American people. Well, the fact is that they had passed an infrastructure bill. Those essential jobs could have been fulfilled in the last 6 months while we have had, the COVID scare and we've shut down the economy. These would have been good paying jobs that would have rebuilt, major parts of our infrastructure. That didn't happen. I look at what's going on in District 24. One of the number one economic drivers in this district is DFW Airport. They've got about $10 billion of infrastructure improvements that they need that has to happen. Wastewater, making sure that when it floods, and often we have heavy rains, planes can still take off and land. And we haven't had that bill that's been passed. You start thinking about our roadways and the major connection that goes through Texas on this. But it's not just infrastructure, but it's also manufacturing. And I think we need to rethink about when we think infrastructure to manufacturing jobs. Because if anything that we have learned over the last 6 months is how vulnerable we are to having those jobs over in China and not having the ability to have our PPEs here, looking at pharmaceutical drugs that are a necessity to people and not having them in this country, but having to rely on a dictatorship like China for them. So if we can do what Trump and this administration has tried to do is bring those manufacturing jobs back to America, but specifically we have areas with technology that's not a huge footprint that we can actually start building them in this district, and looking at that as part of our infrastructure is jobs, but specifically manufacturing jobs. And you think for every manufacturing job that you add, it's a 3-to-1 ratio of how that attracts other jobs within our community and within this district. That is impactful. Those are the focuses that we can have. And we can have these political debates where, it sounds sexy to say such and such and blame, but actually policy work is hard. You have to think, you have to sit down, you have to strategize, and you got to work with everybody. And I just don't see a whole lot of that happening in D.C. today.
No, I think you speak for most people. Troubled, concerned, disappointed, disillusioned. We see our young people today very, I don't know if I would say they're anti-American, but many people don't like this country. And I grew up in a different time and place. I love my country. And we're seeing the generational change. And when we talk about safety, public safety, it comes, again, in all different shapes and sizes. As a member of Congress, you're going to have oversight over the military. And we have a number of military bases, Air Force, the largest Army base in the country, Fort Hood, not in your district, but part of the fabric of our society, of our culture, of Texas. We have a lot of veterans here. Sadly, the military is facing a ever-growing crisis of suicides.
Yeah.
It seems like almost every time you turn on the television, you hear about a young soldier committing suicide or being killed at a base. And I think we have a record number this year. How would you address that? I mean, what steps would you take as a member of Congress to work within the military infrastructure to turn the tide on that problem of suicides?
I mean, suicides, you're saying because of COVID actually affecting a lot of keeping kids out of school, you're seeing increased number of suicides, keeping people, away from others. As we stay home, we're not socializing. You're seeing increases in suicides across the board. Specifically with the military, I think the Trump administration's focus on the VA and restructuring of the VA to make sure that people have more opportunities and more choices for health care. Mental health is going to be number one in that. But expanding choices, not limiting choices. And what I see on the other side of the aisle is these choices have been struck down. When we talk about Obamacare, you've got one size fits all federal government control of your health care. I think that's the exact opposite of what we need to do. A focus on mental health, but about expanding opportunities that fit your needs. So if you want to have more opportunities within your list of physicians, if you have already built a relationship with a doctor, if it's a mental health physician that you want to continue seeing, you can pick and choose. Private health care, is basically we have 600,000 people who are on private healthcare systems right now. My opponent wants to get rid of that. She's all for affordable health care plan, which would strip those 600,000 people out of the plans that they're currently in and that they're enjoying. Now, we have to do a much better job, but public health and mental health is where we really need to start concentrating, because that affects, and if anything, we're going to see that this pandemic is going to put an exclamation point on those issues.
Sadly, I have to agree with you. This is the first time, Beth, I believe, that two women are running for Texas 24. I don't think there's ever been.
You never had a female representative at Texas 24
That's
before.
right.
It's true.
And as a woman, as a person with your background and your experience, you grew up in a military family. Another crisis that's affecting the military, and it's been happening for a number of years, is military sexual assaults, both men and women. I mean, it's been a plague. The military academies have had to deal with this crisis. Sadly, I don't think they've done a very good job, just my opinion. How would you, as a female member of Congress, want to address military sexual assaults, whether it's in the full military or the academies?
That's an interesting question. I've never run, as a female candidate. I'm the only woman mayor that Irving has ever had, but I've never run as a female candidate. I've always said, vote for me because I've got a vision, because I'm strong, because I'm prepared, and because I have results and I'm the best candidate. But as a female candidate dealing with sexual assault and having experience with it and having worked, but also having personal experience with it, I think we would be more apt to ask questions that some of our male counterparts don't feel comfortable asking, and not accepting wash over, brush over answers, but really getting down to the heart of it. And I think it also makes us more sympathetic to the victims of sexual assault. Having a relationship with them beforehand where they feel like they can talk to you and open up, and knowing that you're just not going to brush it off. I think that's really important.
Well, I think it's important that you mentioned it. You have experience. You work for the women's shelter.
I worked for a rape crisis center.
Right.
I was the first student ever for the Cornell Advocates for Rape Education, and I wrote my honors dissertation on it. But it's teaching women to actually have a very strong voice, to have a strong backbone, and to not be embarrassed about that. And I look at what's happened with the hashtag #MeToo movement over the last several years, and it seems like it's put women in a position of victimhood. And, I wrote an article after Trump was elected, but during the inauguration, the next morning, I had my 17-year-old daughter in town, and we were leaving one of the hotels in D.C., and there was a woman wearing a sign that said, "I am scared." And I wrote a tweet on my way to the airport saying, I just saw you, and I didn't point out her name or anything like that. I just saw this woman, to her, I'm a woman. I'm fearless. I have a voice. I am not scared. And the reaction that I got out of that when I got out of the plane was, divisive. 50% loved it, 50% hated it. And I ended up writing an article about it, saying, look, we are strong. We are fierce. We are a force of nature to be dealt with. We need to get that message out to women. That, we can achieve anything that a man can. We deal with a lot more, and we need to stop apologizing for it. But we are not victims. We are strong. And I think that message has been lost over the last 50 years. Back in the 70s, it was, I am woman, hear me roar. And now it's like, oh, you have to take care of me. I think more women, young women, need to have strong female mentors. And when women are in positions of power and they can have a voice to stick up for other women, they need to do that. But how you do that is not by pushing men away. Men are very much a member of our society, members of our community, and it is embracing and having that mutual respect. But it's going to be everybody's voice. And when we start, just by virtue of a gender or a race, putting people into categories, we're losing.
How can people learn more about you?
My website, it's bethfortexas.com, and anybody is welcome to shoot me an email if they've got questions, beth@bethfortexas.com. But I'm out and about in my community. I have always been accessible. So we are going, my job, if I get elected, is going to be to represent District 24 in D.C., not to represent D.C. and District 24. And how you do that is you get out. You get out where people feel most comfortable. As a public servant, I don't have the privilege of being able to work from my couch, right? You have to get out where people feel most comfortable. And we are block walking and talking to people. We are going to events. We are calling people. We're having business tours to understand what's happening with employees right now. We are having roundtables with physicians. We're having roundtables with educators saying, what do we need to open up the schools? But my job is to listen and then to represent what our community wants in D.C. and to fight for it.
I've been speaking with Beth Van Duyne, candidate for Texas 24, running for Congress. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.